The thematics of today's lecture will go far beyond the boundaries of that which is traditionally related to your speciality and to the humanities in the format and volume which is offered to you by the curriculum. Here is the quality of life of modern civilization. Society and states are slaves of money. The law of life is profit regardless of the consequences. The pictures show the consequences. The growth of morbidity statistics overtakes the birth rate. It comes already to oncological lesions of the fetus in the womb. Although oncology is practically not found in the wild, in ancient civilizations, in burial grounds there were single cases of people being affected by oncology. Wastes from everyday life are everywhere. Biologically unacceptable distortions of the circulation of substances in nature are absolutely everywhere. There was such a medicine, thalidomide. It was advertised as a sleeping pill for pregnant women. As a result, around the world, about 50,000 children were born without limbs or with deformed limbs. And our Russia is a burial place of biomaterial, maternity hospital number such and such. So it's bad. And this is how the degradation of the civilization of society looks in life. The top photo, on the left, is Arkhangelsk province. The end of the 19th, the beginning of the 20th century. It was not possible to establish it more precisely. The location is not clear either. And here is the same place 100 years later, a shot of our days. Typical features are the remains of the house, which is in the foreground in the upper photo, and a chapel where the temple stood. And further on, you can see what happens in the city. A question arises, where does this come from? This is the main socio-cultural objective law, to which the life of any civilized society is subordinate. Let us evaluate its performance speed. An idea of pan-social significance appears in science. How long will it take before this idea enters educational standards? About 10 years, maybe even more. Then the system of education adopts the idea, teaching begins. The idea becomes the property of a more or less wide range of people. The system of education shapes the world understanding and intellect of governors, deputies, officials, businessmen, top managers, and they begin to steer. How do they begin to steer? They correlate the flow of operational information with that which they were taught in school and university. And then there arises a spectrum of governorial decisions. The spectrum of governorial decisions, solutions, when the decision is incarnated into life, determines the future quality of life of society. Moreover, it sometimes determines for a very long perspective. Who remembers such a metaphor or idea, an argument about whether every cook has to learn to govern the state? Where did this cook come from? The cook came from Alexander III's 1887 circular restricting access to education for ordinary people. This decree was called among the people, in the circles of the intelligentsia, the decree on cook's children. So the cook came from there. More than 100 years have passed since the publication of this circular and its entry into force, and we are still reaping the consequences. Therefore, this is a very serious regularity that is not found in the textbooks on sociology or in the textbooks on political science. And then it turns out that if you come to the elections, then you are under the illusion that having voted for this or that party, you will get this or that result. But party members and candidates for deputies study at the same universities and master the same science. Therefore, in any case, Americans vote for those scientific schools that are present at Harvard and other institutes of higher education. If you really are not satisfied with the quality of life of society, then you need to start not with the analysis of the programs of political parties, but with the analysis of the science that has been loaded into the system of education, which forms the mentality and the culture of thinking of those people who will then come to work and will determine what exactly, for what objectives, and how governance will be carried out. And the objective law is as follows: one science, one spectrum of solutions, one quality of life. In another, different in content science, there will be a different spectrum of solutions and a different quality of life. In other words, the system, very inertially, covers tens of millions of people in our country and billions of people if we talk about the quality of life of global civilization. There exists a system: biosphere, population, statehood, economy. There is a certain process of historically established self-governance of the system. If we lived in a normal culture, then we would open a textbook on sociology and political science, read everything that happens here, and everything would be clear. If correlating with the principle, practice is the criterion of truth, then you yourselves understand that if science is consistent, then we all live in a prosperous society. Everyone is healthy, well-fed, and so on. And no one thinks about how hard life will be for their children and grandchildren, what will happen to nature. But if these problems exist, then this is an indicator that science is not coping with its duties. Moreover, it is mainly natural sciences and humanitarian generations of natural sciences that have broken away from natural sciences that do not cope. There is such a joke in which there is a grain of joke. Education can be natural scientific and anti-natural, the so-called humanitarian sciences. Why? Because in natural science, in technical applications, the problems of metrological consistency of activity are solved. If there is a concept, then it is determined, and any more or less healthy-minded person who is faced with this concept can see the phenomenon in life that stands behind it. And if we talk about humanitarian sciences, then everything is conditioned by one of Stanislav Lem's tales. There he describes a space traveler on a planet. There is an academy of non-being, which is engaged in the study of non-being, since the banality of being was long ago determined and is of no interest. And as you know, dragons do not exist, but dragons that do not exist are of three types: negative, zero, and imaginary. Imaginary ones don't exist in a much more interesting way than the other two. A certain part of the humanities is now studying those dragons that do not exist, and the consequences in life are more dire than dragons. And in this there is no difference between what was in the USSR and what is now. Read and correlate it. Factually, there is no higher authority in science. The Nobel laureate in economics, an academician of the USSR Academy of Sciences, the creator of one of the leading scientific research institutes, both admit the inconsistency of the science that exists to solve the tasks that need to be solved. And the generator of problems is bourgeois liberalism and the liberal market economic model. Why? Because despite all the liberal propaganda, the liberal market economic model has certain qualities that are not included in the set of propaganda theses. The activity of a plurality of subjects is subordinated to their particular interests. Where do the interests of the system as a whole come from? None of the particular subjects are interested in them, and the market is really incapable of setting the objectives in relation to the way of life of the state, the development of its economy and culture. Moreover, the market does not contain mechanisms for self-configuration to the objectives that politicians proclaim. In society there are three types of activity that, in principle, are impossible on the basis of commercial self-sufficiency. Either they are not possible at all, or they are possible to the volumes necessary for society to develop successfully. What to do? Well, actually, everything as a whole is such that the laws of liberal market price forming are such that the liberal market economic model stably produces mass poverty, unculturedness, environmental problems in the continuity of generations, and in the background of all this, the elite luxuriates, the people drag out existence, and there is no way out of this circular motion in the liberal market economic model. But the question may arise, what about the prosperity of the United States? What about economic prosperity in the developed countries of Europe, Sweden, Finland? The fact is that if one goes into the details, it turns out that the liberal market propaganda is one thing, but the real functioning of their economics is entirely another thing, and how they factually function does not fall into the field of propaganda. Therefore, Everyone is convinced that the market regulates everything by itself. But for some reason in Germany, it is regulated in one way, but somewhere in the middle of Africa, a completely different way. And the world of capitalism is not only Sweden, the Federal Republic of Germany, and the United States. This is about 7 billion of the rest of the population, which is factually dragging out a miserable existence, and there are no prospects for improvement, and no prospects are expected. But no comment on this. Read it, laugh to whom it is funny, cry to whom it is not funny. This is all illustrations to the fact that education can be natural scientific and anti-natural. Because if we approach from unified scientific methodological standpoints, then in general it turns out that we actually do not have scientific consistent sociology and political science. In economics, everything except accounting and mathematics is either nonsense or from evil, and then we wonder why we live the way we live, but not the way we would like. In fact, everything, from education in the field of sociology, political science, economics, theory of state and law, is now a state-legalized falsification. Well, this caricature is a compliment to socio-economic science, and moreover, it is a slander against shamans, because shamans would cope with these questions better than most. Well, if we go from life, that is, follow the shamanic approach, if we want to live so that the politics of the state is scientifically grounded, we must deal with the objective laws to which the life of society and every one of the people is subordinate. These objective laws can be summarized into 6 groups. First, humanity is part of the biosphere, and there exist objective laws of the pan-biospheric level that regulate the interaction of the biosphere with the environment and regulate the relationship of biological species of biocenoses with one another. Humanity is a specific biological species that differs from all others. Therefore, there exists a second group of specific objective laws that distinguishes humanity as a biological species from everything else. Further on, a very slippery theme arises. There is a teaching on the NOOSPHERE, authors Vernadsky and Teilhard de Chardin. On the one hand, when it comes to them, they are outstanding scientists. And on the other hand, when they begin discussions on the theme that the planet as a whole has reason, and the reason of the planetary level has an impact on the flow of life, on the life of every person, then people get lost and they begin to insist that this is nonsense, because since childhood, they have not been shown how this manifests itself in life, and they themselves do not guess it. What is the reason? We live in a culture where the overwhelming majority of the population is convinced that ethics is localized within society, while the teaching on the NOOSPHERE assumes that ethics is not localized within society, but goes beyond society and returns to society from outside of it. And accordingly, if you turn to Dahl's explanatory dictionary, you will see that volks are characterized by the words cloud dispersers. That is, they could somehow find a common language with nature about what kind of weather was needed. What is it for? In the same place, in Dahl's dictionary, there is a saying, "Sages keep abundance." What is abundance based on? It is based on the fact that the rain should come at the right time. The crop has grown. When it needs to be harvested, there should be no rain. The crop should not be wet. It should not be rotten. In other words, in pagan times, talking with nature was the norm of things. The second question is related to the fact that there are also religious objective laws. The bulk of the population belongs to 2 groups. One group believes that God is not, and the other group believes that God is. Then a very interesting point arises. In all cultures there are genres of literature, which in the Russian language are called the lives of the saints. That is, the narratives of the lives and activities of certain people who are revered as saints. It turns out that if you read the lives of the saints, then for the saints the question of the existence of God was not a matter of faith. It was a matter of reliable knowledge, which was confirmed by everyday prayer practice. And it was ethically confirmed by the fact that life flowed in accordance with the meaning of their prayers. Well, there may be an objection. The saints lived long ago. Over many centuries, it was possible to make up anything. But in reality, well, relatively recently, John of Kronstadt, a saint of the Russian Orthodox Church, among other things, left memoirs that can be read. This document is authentic and is not falsified. It contains no fictions that would have been introduced there by the editors who improved the past in order to govern the future. So John of Kronstadt writes that there were cases when people were healed through prayers, despite the efforts of medicine. There were several cases when people, in the terminology of that era, were resurrected. That is, they came out of clinical death or came out of a coma thanks to his prayer. And at the same time, for him it is greatly regretful and very unclear why his prayers for the bestowal of health to Alexander III remained in vain, and Alexander III died. To put it differently, the question boils down to the fact that one can believe in God, one cannot believe in God, but one can believe God or not believe God. And the choice to trust God or not to trust God is the choice of every person. If you turn to the texts of what is called the scriptures, then almost all of them, in one form or another, say that a person should live normally in dialogue with God. The Quran says directly, "And when my servants question thee concerning me, then surely I am nigh. I answer the prayer of the suppliant when he crieth unto me. So let them hear my call, and let them trust in me, in order that they may be led aright." So if you respond, then how does the call come? The call comes through sovest. Again, if you study the literature published before 1917 and after 1917, you will find the difference. Until 1917, sovest was the innate sense that explains to a person what is dobro, what is evil, in the concretics of life situations. After 1917, sovest is not an innate sense, it is a culturally conditioned skill that is cultivated. How is it cultivated? The reality is such that by the end of the third grade of our school, sovest and shame are successfully squeezed out of the process of developing a line of behavior of the majority. Well, so you don't have to wonder why we live like this. Therefore, the third group of objective laws are factually, ethically, and raviously conditioned objective laws that affect the life of every one of us and the life of societies through the noosphere of the planet and through what is called religion. That is, either there is a connection between man and God or not, or it is perverted. In addition to that, humanity carries culture. Here again we are faced with the fact that in the humanities there are many definitions of what culture is, and all of them do not give a clear idea of what it is. Let us take an example. A dragonfly hatches from a larva. It is a biologically, informationally, full-fledged representative of its biological species. What is required in order for a dragonfly to live and function? Information algorithmic support for the behavior of the dragonfly. In the dragonfly, all the information algorithmic support for behavior is an innate, alternativeless, and unambiguously programmed program that is transmitted at the level of genetics. Then culture, what is it? The same thing. Culture is information algorithmic support for the life of society, also in that part that every person has mastered personally. That is, it is also information algorithmic support for behavior. There is social culture and personal culture. The common thing is that this is not genetically transmitted. On the basis of genetics, only the potential for the development of culture is transmitted. And further on, you master the culture as you grow up. So the innate component is alternativeless, but the culture is variable. We can build a culture that will kill society during the life of 2 to 3 generations, or we can build a culture that will ensure the inner harmony of the life of society and the harmony of the civilization of the biosphere. And this culture will be stably reproduced in the continuity of generations, and it will open up some new possibilities for the development of humanity, which we now cannot even imagine. But nevertheless, socio-cultural objective laws also exist. We see the progress of civilization as the development of technology. But if one looks at the essence, then actually the essence has not changed since the Stone Age. And the essence is simple. Without the technosphere of artificial, man-made habitat, the monkey of the species Homo sapiens cannot live in most regions of the planet. The monkey of the species Homo sapiens protects himself from the natural environment by creating an artificial habitat, the technosphere. And the only difference is that in the Stone Age, we protected ourselves with a stone axe and fire, but now we have nuclear reactors and much more. The essence, however, is the same. We protect ourselves from the natural environment, but we do not live in harmony with it. As for the technosphere, it does not reproduce itself of its own accord. Plus, we do not eat on the basis of foraging. All this requires the organization of production and distribution. This is the field of economy. There are objective laws of the economy that guarantee either mass poverty and life from hand to mouth, or prosperity for everyone, when there is enough of everything, and this everything is guaranteed. Moving further on, all these objective laws operate in their own spheres, impact each other. But in the automatic mode, civilization is not governed so that there is heaven on earth. Therefore, the manifestations of all these objective laws in the life of society must be governed. There exist objective laws of governance, which are the same, regardless of whether your child rides a tricycle, or several states try to implement a complex project on the principles of state-private partnership. The objective laws of governance are the same. If we turn to the encyclopedias and look at the article Cybernetics, then we will find out that cybernetics is the science about governance. Then the question arises, if cybernetics is the science about governance, then why is the book of the founder of cybernetics, Norbert Wiener, named Cybernetics, not included in the standards of universal education? If you want, go to the library, take cybernetics, read it from the beginning to end. You will learn a lot of interesting things, except one. You will not learn anything about the objective laws of governance, how to organize the process of governance, and how to enter into it. Further, we have a myth on the theme that the evil tyrant Stalin organized a persecution of cybernetics, and as a result, we got what we got. But if we turn to history and science, then all our research in the field of theories of governance traces back to Ivan Alexeyevich Vishnegradsky, Minister of Finance of the Russian Empire, professor of the neighboring Technological Institute. So if we turn to cybernetics itself, it turns out that cybernetics at the time of its creation was empty. It was a label. And under this empty label, for many decades, all the research studies related to any kind of governance have taken place. As a result, over several decades, cybernetics has been filled with some content, but it hasn't become a universal science on governance. This is expressed in the fact that technical cybernetics cannot always agree with biological, medical, juridical cybernetics. I did not misspeak. One of the authors of the Constitution worked in the Juridical Cybernetics Laboratory of Moscow State University. Well, if you understand that the Constitution and all legislation should express the principles and algorithms of governance, then you see that not everything is going well with juridical cybernetics. That is, there is something to do. Well, and further on, the situation is as follows. There is a course on social science in school. In institutes of higher education, there is a course on sociology, a course on political science. There are also faculties of economics and universities of economics. There are courses on the theory of governance, management, and cybernetics. All this is taught, but all those courses do not give real knowledge that could be applied to solve tasks and improve the quality of life of each and everyone in society. There is a metaphor about the tree of knowledge. The tree of knowledge is an apple tree. Why an apple tree but not a fir tree? Because the fir tree has one mighty trunk that goes vertically, while the apple tree has a crown. When the metaphor in the tree of knowledge appeared, there was no such concept as an algorithm. And if you draw what is now called a block diagram, this also went beyond the limits of understanding. But nonetheless, the apple tree, as the image of a certain block diagram, gives a certain idea on the process of cognition, if this metaphor is properly unpacked. So it turns out that the soil is objective reality and texts inherited from past eras. The roots are methodology of cognition. This is the branch of philosophy called gnoseology. Well, further, what do chemists do? They govern the flow of processes. What do farmers do? Govern the flow of processes, but in a different subject domain. Therefore, the trunk is a certain theory of governance, the quality of which, of chief importance, should be universality of application. That is, in all subject domains, any process can be interpreted with the help of the theory of governance as a process of governance or self-governance. And then, if this is possible, the main thing happens. What is now known as interdisciplinary chasms? They disappear. An interdisciplinary chasm is when a specialist in one science is not able to understand a specialist in another science, and together they cannot work in concert in solving some complex tasks, cannot work on complex projects which require a certain interconnection of professionalism of different branches of science and subject domains. I probably don't need to tell you who academicians B.V. Rauschenbach and S.P. Korolev are. In one of the interviews, Rauschenbach was asked to characterize Korolev, with whom he worked for a long time. Rauschenbach was silent for a while, and then he said, "If one term, then regiment commander." Korolev, according to Rauschenbach, was neither an outstanding engineer nor an outstanding scientist. He was a regiment commander, whose willpower and world understanding were able to coordinate the professionalism of a great amount of people, from biology to technology, in the space programs of the Soviet Union, and coordinate it very effectively. Because by and large, we still live by the legacy of Sergei Pavlovich Korolev. The legacy of Sergei Pavlovich stems from the era that is considered in our country the era of despotism and tyranny. We live under the protection of what was created then, because the most mass-produced strategic bomber in Russia is the Tu-95. It had its first flight in November 1952. Joseph Vissarionovich was still alive. And so, the sufficiently general theory of governance is the trunk. And the crown is applied scientific disciplines. The boundaries of the trunk are metrologies. People with technical education understand that if it is impossible to measure, then it is out of discussion. People with education in humanitarian sciences do not understand this. Such people, when it comes to social questions of the development of the country, throw in such words as passionarity, ethnos, superethnos. If we turn to the works of L.N. Gumilyov, then there are several tens of definitions of ethnos in one of his books. Therefore, by ethnos, everyone understands anything depending on the circumstances. Another one, at the same time, by the same word, understands something completely different. It is impossible to agree and work on the basis of such a science. The reason that education of humanities is anti-natural, this is the unresolved problems of metrology in humanities. If the problems are somehow solved by someone, then the reader of his works sees the same phenomenon behind that someone's words, and they are not in disagreement with each other in opinions. If the problems of metrological consistency in the humanities are resolved, then the division of sciences into humanitarian sciences, natural and technical sciences, also disappears. This is all one science, but different branches with a single methodology, with a single criteria of scientific consistency. And then possibilities for a better life will open up. In the slide, it is highlighted in red that the roots are the methodology of cognition, and logically, if you read the section of gnoseology in a textbook on philosophy, and if you are not completely stupid, then you should understand how the methodology of cognition works in your psyche, how the psyche is buggy, why it does not work very well, and what to do to make everything work well. But in reality, it turns out that gnoseology as a branch of philosophy does exist, but there is no intelligible explanation on the theme of how the human psyche works in the mode of cognition and creativity. Therefore, if you have read this section, passed the test, then you can definitely forget about all that, and do not go back to this theme again, Or you may develop this very gnoseology yourself in order that it would be intelligible and understandable. Or simply cognize the world, create something the way you can do it, and maybe improve your method of cognition and creativity. Further, about objective laws. So the fact has been known since 1944-1946. Academician N.P. Dubinin was not yet an academician, but in the city of Voronezh, he and others studied the fruit fly, the Drosophila, a favorite object of research for geneticists since these flies die quickly, generations change quickly, so there is an opportunity to observe objective laws. And they found that the fly in the city of Voronezh, after its liberation in the Great Patriotic War, when there was nothing there but broken bricks, is identical in genetic populations to the fly in the countryside or rural areas. In 1946, the study was repeated, and it turned out that the fly had mutated. According to Italian geneticists, it is enough to work in a foundry for 3 days in order that the organism would react with mutations. But the genetic mechanism has its own repair processes. In fact, the body is able to cut out defective pieces of chromosomes and replace them with correct ones. And this takes some time. But the intensity of the mutagenic effect of the urban environment is such that it is impossible to reproduce a biologically healthy population in cities. This manifests itself in the fact that, according to research by Canadian psychologists, the IQ of urban children is 3 to 5 points lower than the IQ of their peers living in rural areas. Elvira Nabulina, when she was the head of the Ministry of Economic Development, spoke at the Moscow Urban Forum. The main ideas of the speech are as follows. Cities give the most gross product, support for small towns and rural settlements is 2 to 3% of the loss of economic growth. The entire population has to be pulled into 10 urban agglomerations. But here there is a whole slew of problems, the curse of infrastructures, lack of housing, and so on and so forth. What to do, we do not know. This is an indicator that the head of the Ministry of Economic Development should not be a person who knows nothing but accounting. But even accounting she knows badly. The latter refers to the activity of the head of the central bank. There is such a question. How much money is there in the financial credit system? How much money is needed for everything to be good? There are 2 answers to this question. Both of them are correct, but one is not correct in terms of governance. You can request statistics, and you will be given the answer that the amount of money mass we have is such and such in denominations. Or there may be the other answer. There is always 100% of money in the financial credit system. If the second answer is given, then the question arises about the distribution of these 100% among the wallets of juridical and physical persons. And when there is 100% of money, it is impossible not to issue money, not to take money mass out of circulation, because there is always 100%. Further, another question arises. What is money backed up by? There was a time when money was backed by gold. There was a gold standard. And if we turn to the Code of Hammurabi, then we will see that payments in grain and silver were recognized as legal, and there was a conversion rate for grain and silver and vice versa. Why grains? Because in ancient times the well-being of society was determined by how many people and draft animals one could feed. The main energy source was grain. And Hammurabi simply reflected in this code the law of conservation of energy in the economy. Therefore, it turns out that on the one side of the scale you have 100% of money, and on the other side of the scale you have a potential of energy that you can put into the economy. You cannot get more products from the real sector than you can put energy there, and more than is allowed by the energy conversion efficiency of technology and logistics. And the worst thing that can be done is to grossly violate this ratio between the nominal 100% of them, in nominally financial terms, and the energy supply capacity of the real sector. And it can be violated in 2 ways. You can print a lot of money, and then, due to the difference in the rate of the flow of finance, through the industries. Some industries will have excessive financial solvency in relation to the utilization of their production capacities, and others insufficient financial solvency, and your entire economy will collapse. This was done by E.T. Gaidar, A.B. Chubais, and others like them in the 1990s. N.K. Babiakov, the chairman of the State Planning Committee, described these reforms as follows. At best, 10 years in the gulags, if these guys had not been shot in Stalin's times. And he was right, because Gaidar and Chubais grossly violated the energy standard of the ruble. There is yet another method, to introduce into the system loan interest. While the denominations are being circulated, the role of loan interest is not clear. As soon as you get into the system where there is 100% money, you find that money neatly flows unidirectionally into the property of the corporation of usurers. And in the rest of the system, you are faced with rising prices. The rise in prices leads to the fact that the purchasing power of working capital, in order to load production capacities and develop them, is also not enough. Further, as the deficiency of working capital grows in the sectors, the same collapse of input-output proportions and economic connections begins. Our central bank has been dealing with this on the basis of the Constitution since 1993 and does not bear any legal responsibility, because the Constitution states that the task of the central bank is to ensure the stability of the ruble. The term of ruble stability is not juridically defined. Therefore, the central bank can do whatever it wants. Juridically, there is nothing for which it can be held accountable. What is the stability of the ruble? The stability of the ruble is the stability of its purchasing power towards a certain basket of goods. That is, the best stability is negative inflation. Negative inflation is what happened during the time of Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin. Long live the Stalinist policy of systematic price reduction. For information, from 1947 to 1952, the consumer price index in the USSR fell by about 2 times with an increase in the nominal income of the population. So there is something to ponder over. And here we have a possible type of alternative. Beautiful, isn't it? This is Amatsiems in Latvia, a settlement, so to speak, a town of millionaires. But the fact that this is a town of millionaires is a fundamental mistake, because a settlement can only exist stably when the bulk of its population works there, and jobs are within walking or cycling distance. The task is to make nature accessible. And this can be done for everyone, but not in the liberal market economic model. This is how family estates are integrated into the landscape. And further on there starts another thing. This is a table of the relationship of social institutions. A social institution can be defined as follows. An intrasocial formation which stably performs certain functions that other social institutions or people alone cannot fulfill. Fundamental social institutions are family, statehood, science, and system of education. In the table, they are considered horizontally as sources of goods, and vertically as recipients of goods. There is one default connected with the table. 2 ways of thinking are inherent in a person. The first way, we think by situations that do not have internal dynamics, and the process appears as a sequence transition from one situation to another. That is, this is roughly analogous to unfolding a reel of film and watching the frames one by one. The second way is to think by processes. That is, each frame has internal dynamics, and it can be expanded into a separate film reel, into a separate movie. The table represents the process of the life of society at intervals of time embracing the change of several generations. If you understand this, and are able to fill in the table, then the question arises as to governance towards all this in the continuity of generations, so that every institution fulfills its functions, so that their interaction is correct, harmonious. Because if the functions of any of the institutions are violated, or the character of their interaction is violated, society as a whole experiences a lot of troubles. And with us, the functions of many social institutions are violated, and their interconnections are also violated. And in order for everything to be good, the state must ensure the solution of this sequence of tasks in cyclics. First, harmony of the civilization of the biosphere. It is expressed in the structure of land use in a region. That is, in the region, this percentage should be tied to certain landscapes. Protected areas, 40%. There should be no one there, except for the staff of the areas and excursions under the guidance of the staff according to the schedule in sync with the biorhythmics of nature. Now hardly anyone can remember this, but back in the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, people in our country lived according to the principle, from this to that time, no foot in the forest. Why? Because there all living creatures breed. If you scare birds out of the nest, then there will be no more birds. If there are no birds, then there will be big biospheric troubles, which one way or another will affect the crop. Now the places where the car can reach are polluted, and these are places where it was clean until there appeared society-wide automobilization. Further, in Russia, 42% of the territories are places where nature exists and where people can be on their own. 10.5% is agricultural land, with traditional agriculture, 7.3% is settlements, and 0.2% is landfills, such as Krasny Bor, rubbish dumps and everything else, industrial harsh landscapes, such as Magnitka, Severstal, some petroleum refinery where no biocenoses can exist. And the state is obliged to work out a biospheric ecological policy in connection with all these percentages in every region to the territory. Further, an infrastructure policy should be tied to this, and the infrastructure policy should also be tied with a demographic policy, which explains how many people should be born and where, what cultural indicators should be achieved with entrance into adulthood, and how migration is carried out within the country, on account of the influx of fresh gene pool from other regions, compensate the damage to health caused by life in cities. And all this requires economic support. Therefore, the following is necessary: state planning, a continuous system of planning of the development of the economy, and the provision by the economy of all the needs of the state and society. Further comes complex economic activity in the stream of the plan. And since a plan is one thing, but complex economic activity is somewhat different, then complex economic activity should also be corrected, including tax legislation that should provide the possibility of redistributing excess profits between industries if they arise, in order for the economy as a whole to respond to the needs of society. The demographic policy should include 4 components and principles: the fundamental growth in the rural areas. The quality of compulsory education in the rural areas should not be lower than in the city. Biospheric ecological rehabilitation of megapolises on account of their depopulation and the influx of population from rural areas. But all this, again, does not work on the principles of market liberalism. Then the question arises: if you come from the Faculty of Economic Cybernetics, and like a dull engineer, governor, specialist in automatic control of an aircraft or rocket, and you ask them a question typical for an engineer: in what are the vector of objectives of governance and the vector of error expressed? In technical tasks of governance, there are natural questions without an answer to which there is no control, no governance. Economic cybernetics won't tell you anything. The needs of people for products can be divided into 2 large classes, demographically conditioned. They are conditioned by biology and culture. The satisfaction of these needs is necessary for the development of society, and it is safely guaranteed. If we put the demographic pyramid on its side and connect it to the chronological axis, then we will find out that demography is predictable for decades and centuries ahead. Groups of personal needs are connected with demography. How many pants, shirts for kids are needed, how many vacant places are needed in kindergartens, schools, and so on. This is prognosed for decades, centuries ahead. There are also family needs. Production volumes are conditioned by the typology of families and the number of families. There are infrastructural needs. They are conditioned by the way of life of civilization. Everything is predictable. But if predictable, then you can proactively govern and build productive capacities in order to guaranteedly ensure the satisfaction of these needs. Structurally algorithmically, the task is equivalent to the task of homing a self-guided projectile at a slowly maneuvering target. This was successfully solved in the interests of the military-industrial complex of the mid-1950s in the space of parameters 3 at the rate of real time. The space of parameters is of course larger here, but no one forces you to give an answer within a few seconds either. Within a year, you're required to form a plan for the foreseeable future, which is quite possible. Computer technology allows it if one has the desire. And then we again balk. It turns out that this is not being studied now. In fact, this is a mathematical expression of a children's nursery rhyme. A magpie cooked porridge. When you ask full-time students to repeat this nursery rhyme, they stop at the fact that the magpie gave it to this one, gave it to that one, but did not give it to the other one. Evening students think differently and begin to list who did what, and the one who did nothing was given nothing. These are input-output balances, balances of product exchange and financial exchange. This is a separate theme, and the main complaint about economics. There is no adequate governorial interpretation, because in order to use it, one needs to know how in this is the vector of objectives of governance expressed, and how is the vector of errors of governance expressed. Well, this is what should be spoken of. This actually is the whole problematics, which goes far beyond the standard courses of sociology, political science and economics, and which one needs to know in order for everything to be good. Moreover, you may have a question: why should you, as future engineers, know this? Because the current generation, and several more generations, have been crippled by the reform of the system of education carried out in the 90s. The director of the St. Petersburg State Electrotechnical University, Leti, speaking on the radio of Russia, said that after they had recruited freshmen on the basis of the unified state exam, the teachers were faced with the learning disabilities of the freshmen. They were asked to solve the tests of entrance exams in physics and mathematics of the pre-unified state exam era. The result was discouraging: 2.4 GPA in physics and 2.6 in math. To make it clear how badly they failed, I will explain the following. In the 1970s at Leti, there were specialities which it was impossible to enter, having 23 points in the entrance exam, and plus a secondary school certificate. That is, you had to have 4.5 points for the school certificate, and were eligible to get 1/4 in the exams. In this case, you would have 23.5 points, and you could enter these specialties. Now these specialties are studied by those who received 2.4 points in physics and 2.6 in mathematics. Moreover, one more thing, pay attention. The average score in physics is lower than the average score in mathematics. Why? Because when in mathematics you come to the conclusion that you need to multiply 2 by 3, you absolutely do not care what is behind the 2 and what is behind the 3. But in order to multiply something in physics, you must know exactly what is behind the first multiplier, what is behind the second. You are engineers, and somewhere there is the state and municipal governance. I have an example from there. Bachelors, third-year students, first lecture. In order to understand what they know, I propose to write an essay and illuminate a number of questions. One of the questions: the economy as an object of governance. In a group of 26 people, 23 write nonsense and 6 write: the economy is not an object of governance, the economy is a subject of governance because everything depends on it. What do I mean to say by saying this? You will become engineers and you will have to live under their governance. But that is not all. Time passed, they received their master's degrees. I came to the audience, familiar faces. From what I told them the last time 2 years ago, they could remember only that it was interesting at the lectures, but they could not say anything in essence. When I accuse them of poor attendance, it turns out that I am to blame for this. I do not control the attendance at my lectures, so they do not attend them. In other words, these are already formed, matured bureaucrats who do not know anything and do not want to know anything, and anyone is responsible but not them. So what can they do? I propose a business game on the theme Algorithmics of Working Out of Governorial Decisions. If it is a business game, then everyone has to participate. And the theme, Algorithmics of Working Out of Governorial Decisions, has to be such that everyone should get the necessary knowledge. I explain the scenario of the game. You graduate from the institute, and now you, having made a career, become the Minister of Education and Science of the Russian Federation. While you were pursuing your career, there appeared a movement enlarging on the internet on the theme that the teachings of Copernicus are false, and the Earth is actually flat. The sun and moon spin around it, and so science has been deceiving the population for several centuries. It is necessary to start teaching true flat Earth science in schools. The movement has gained the strength required by law, and you, as the head of the Ministry of Education and Science of the Russian Federation, must give a reasoned answer. Then the circus begins. One of the students says, "I will assemble a committee of scientists who will give the correct opinion." My answer: the committee of scientists will be made up of people interested in splitting the budget and grants for additional research and writing of textbooks. Number 2 says, "I will hold a popular referendum." I explain the role of political technologists, a programming of the results of the referendum. Some students recall Aristotle. Aristotle, I say, had an opinion, but references to him are not Aristotle's opinion and are not your opinions. And there is Magellan, they say. There is an anecdote. A document was found in the secret archives of the Vatican, according to which Magellan was not killed by savages, but fell off the edge of the earth and died. Therefore, your opinions and this anecdote are textually equivalent to each other. Which one of them is true? They began to ponder. Our lecture was taking place on the 5th floor in the afternoon. I say, if you look out the window, what do you see? The horizon. And if the earth was flat, would you see the horizon? Their opinions split, but again, no reasoned argumentation. I had to explain that by virtue of the fact that the atmosphere does not have absolute transparency, in the case of a flat earth, they would not see the horizon, and objects would be dissolved in a haze, as it is in a fog. The only thing is that in a fog, the visibility range would be several meters, and in clear weather, several hundred kilometers. That is, they do not know how to use even the knowledge that is commonly known, but they will come and govern. We once discussed the issue of education reform at the Education Committee of the Leningrad region. There were experts there, a doctor of pedagogical sciences, a candidate of philological sciences. Their opinions were the following. The fact that the Leti freshmen are not able to solve problems in physics and mathematics is not an indicator of the failure of reform, because every era has its own requirements for knowledge and skills. Look at how young people use gadgets, and the question on the fact that the gadgets of old generations will be replaced by gadgets of new generations, and that gadgets of new generations will require for their design and production much deeper knowledge in physics, chemistry, maybe biology, because the information capacity of biological systems is higher than the information capacity of crystal inorganic lattices. All this is out of discussion in the Education Committee of the Leningrad region. And the fact that the students of the Institute of State and Municipal Administration are not able to think and use knowledge is also not an indicator of whether the earth is flat or round. This is not a practical question, but a philosophical one, that is, divorced from life. The fact is, if you start teaching a theory about flat earth, all navigation science, GLONASS and cosmonautics will collapse. They, in the Education Committee of the Leningrad region, do not suspect this. Therefore, there is nothing more dangerous than a narrow specialist. And then the question arises, what does one have to know in order not to be a narrow specialist? The answer is simple. One needs to know what is in the narrow speciality and as much as possible outside of it, regardless of whether it's history, psychology, biology, geography, cosmogony, etc. And you are put in such conditions that many of you, facing the activities of today's graduates of the Institute of State and Municipal Administration, those who will become officials, will have to enter government bodies, the systems of enterprise and business governance, and you will have to squeeze bureaucrats out of there. And in order to squeeze bureaucrats out of there, you need to know a lot and be able to do a lot.
Надо очень много чего знать и много чего уметь.